What is your definition of power, Work Positive Nation? Have you experienced power employed at work to transform organizations, to empower strategies which teams implement for greater growth? Today's guest on this episode of the Work Positive Podcast is an amazing leader in over 25 countries where companies and leaders wish to transform and grow. They choose to be honest, to lead with the power of truth, justice, and purpose, which is also the title of his latest book. He's a two-time TEDx speaker where his talk on power has over 1.3 million views. He contributes regularly to the Harvard Business Review, where in 2016 his work was named one of the management ideas that mattered most. He also contributes to Forbes, Fast Company, and other fine publications. So as you listen, think about your definition of power, Work Positive Nation, and let's learn from a highly influential thought leader about how power shapes a positive work culture.
Welcome to the Work Positive Podcast with your host, executive coach, and culture architect, Dr. Joey Fawcett. Discover strategies and tactics that work positive as Dr. Joey talks with industry leaders who create a positive work culture that attracts top talent and reduces team turnover. Discover how you can create a work positive culture that increases productivity and profits. Here's your host, Dr. Joey.
Work Positive Nation, help me welcome to this episode of the Work Positive Podcast, Ron Carucci. Ron, I'm absolutely delighted to have you on the Work Positive Podcast. Thank you for your time and wisdom today.
Dr. Joey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Oh, glad to. And Chester Elton and Gary Ridge are mutual friends as well. So, man, we're blessed here in Work Positive Nation to have some great people sharing some immense wisdom with us. So I'm greatly intrigued about your latest book, To Be Honest. Where'd you come up with that title?
Well, it's certainly not an expression like we're unfamiliar with. People say it about 1,000 times a day. It's one of the most common qualifiers to advertise the fact that I'm about to say something honest. But it began with a 15-year research study, a longitudinal study of 3,200 leaders. We wanted to find out if you could predict under what conditions people would tell the truth and behave fairly and serve a greater good, and under what conditions people lie, cheat, and serve their own interests first. And we wanted to know, if you could predict that, could you then shape cultures and environments where people would make better choices? I think we're all tired of the Theranos story and the, Volkswagen stories and the stories where, suddenly otherwise good people turn to the dark side. So we did the research and found out that in fact, indeed, you can predict that there actually are precursor conditions that set the stage for folks to make good or bad choices. We didn't decide to write the book until we realized that there were amazing stories to tell. The book is a book of heroes. I didn't want to write about the villains anymore. I think we all hear enough about them.
They get enough press, right?
But people would be asking us to say, hey, could you run the college admissions scandal through your 4 findings? Or could you run this scandal through your 4 findings to sort of see if we could reverse engineer? And after doing that about twice, your soul just feels like depleted. And I thought, well, surely we couldn't have found things that nobody can do. Surely we found conditions that somebody's living out in a positive way. And so we went looking for those stories. And when we found them, teeming out of the woodwork, that's when we decided to write the book. That what it takes, to be honest, is a lot more than we once thought. And honesty is not... it's not a character trait. It's actually a muscle. It's actually a capability you have to work at to be good at.
Well, I always wonder when someone qualifies to be honest, does that mean they were lying before now?
Yep.
Now we've run up on a place where you're really going to be transparent and authentic. You mentioned 4 qualifiers, Ron. Share those with us, please.
So the first one was a clear, consistent identity. Be who you say you are. When your actions and words match as an organization or an individual, we all have things on the wall. Let's say mission, vision, values, purpose, brand, whatever. Turns out those words matter, and that when people's lived experience of those words are consistent, you're 3 times more likely to have people be honest. But when what's on the wall doesn't match what's experienced, you've now institutionalized duplicity. You've now told people, hey, around here, it's okay to say one thing and do another. And when that's the case, you're now 3 times more likely to have people lie. The second was justice and dignity and accountability. So a fair playing field for everybody to be able to succeed on, and people treated with dignity. When you talk about their contributions, you talk about them, right? So today's workplace, The contributor and the contribution are more fused than ever. It's no longer about how many cases I closed or how many files I processed. It's my ideas, my analysis, my insight, my point of view. So if you treat my contribution with dignity, you treat me that way. When that's the case, you're 4 times more likely to have me be honest. But if I think the system is rigged, if I show up and I feel like I can't be as successful as anybody else, now you're 4 times more likely to have me lie because I have to embellish my accomplishments and hide my mistakes. The third was transparency. So when you walk into meetings and there's people sitting around a table and you believe that what's happening around that table is an honest exchange of ideas, that the person in front of the room is presenting a balanced point of view, and you'd be welcome to offer a point of view that was different than the one in the room. That's when you know you have governance that's transparent. Now you're 3.5 times more likely to have people be honest. But if I walk into that room and I think it's orchestrated theater, that it's just performative, that people are nodding in the right direction, but nobody wants to do anything else. The person at the front of the room is clearly bending reality toward a certain outcome. And the last thing I think you want to hear is a different point of view from me. Now you're 3.5 times more likely to have me lie because I have to go find the truth underground. I can't find it in the room. And the last one was cross-functional relationships. So the seams of the organization where your competitive value is created, when sales meets marketing, when supply chain meets operations, when finance meets R&D. The places where the most conflict happens, turns out when those seams are stitched well, when there really is a place for that natural tension to be held well, you're 6 times more likely to have people be honest.
6.
Huge factor. But if those seams are rivalries, if it's we and they, once you fragment the organization, you now fragment the truth. Now you're 6 times more likely to have people lie because I'm no longer interested in a single source of truth. I'm interested in making sure you know that I'm right and you're wrong. And the interesting thing about the statistical models, Joey, is that they're cumulative. So if you can do all 4 of those things well, you're 16 times more likely to have people be honest.
Amazing.
And by honest, we mean tell the truth, behave fairly, and serve a greater good. Truth, justice, and purpose. But if you suck at all 4 of those things, you're now 16 times more likely to put yourself on the headline of a newspaper story you never wanted to be in.
Tell us, Ron, about some of these superheroes, the heroes who are 16 times more likely to truth, justice, and the pursuit of happiness.
Gosh,
pursuit of purpose.
There were so many of them that I had the incredible privilege of curating their stories. In fact, at the website I gave you, tobehonest.net, we videoed all the interviews, or a good number of them.
Oh, wow.
And we knew that we wouldn't be able to use all the material, but we wanted to save it because the stories were so amazing. So we created a TV series. So it's a news magazine show called Moments of Truth. That's all curated. You can binge watch all 15 episodes at the website, tobehonest.net. One of that comes to mind is also a mutual friend of Gary and Chester's and mine, Hubert Joly, the former CEO of Best Buy. An incredible gifted leader and an incredibly good-hearted man, showed up to an organization that was on the brink of bankruptcy. And rather than, following all the prevailing wisdom of closing stores and cutting costs, he decided to go listening to people and stay on the store floors and watch what people were experiencing and listen to the challenges of his employees, and decided that unleashing the human magic there, unleashing a deep sense of purpose was how he was going to transform that company. And that's what he did. They hosted a series of many conversations and workshops called Best Buy at Our Best, and asked people, when are we at our best? And listen to painful stories and beautiful stories of purpose, and realize that if I can connect their purpose to our purpose, I will unleash the human magic in this organization. And over the 9 years, or almost 9 years he was CEO, the stock price went from hovering around $11 to just over $100.
Wow.
Employee retention went through the roof. It's one of the many, many heartening stories that I got the privilege of hearing about in the book.
So which of those 4 qualities did he really accent?
Gosh, I think you'd see him hit on all of them. He stitched the seams, but we highlight him under purpose. We highlight him on the story of connecting people's purpose to the broader purpose and unleashing that power. But I think governance was transparent. I think people felt dignified in their work. And I think he made sure all the parts of the organization were talking to each other.
There's so many people today, and I'm thinking about your transparency qualifier, Ron. There's so many people today who want to talk about DEI, belonging. Bob Johansson, another one of our guests, wants to add belonging, DEIB, and so many more people are talking about belonging now. How does transparency and this whole DEI emphasis now, DEIB, how do those line up in your research? What did you discover about that?
People show up to work every day with two questions on their mind. Do I matter and do I belong? Meaning, does my work make a significant contribution to the organization? Is it set apart some way, or am I just a cog in your wheel? Do I belong? It means, do I fit in? Am I welcomed in the tribe, as Gary would say? Or do I have to hide part of myself? Do I have to edit part of myself? Do I have to contort myself to fit in? When the answer to both of those questions is an unqualified yes, I am now freed up to perform. But if any one of those questions is in doubt, I now have to settle for the counterfeit, which is looking like I matter and looking like I belong. And we've all seen the movie when people have to perform those things. Transparency goes away because you've now told me I can't be transparent. I have to be something, a concocted version of myself.
Right, a false stuff.
So transparency really means that I know people think the word is overused, but an authentic version of you, right? A part of you that says, I'm not hiding. I'm not trying to twist myself to fit your image. And that's when you get a sense of real transparency, when I can tell you the truth, when I can tell you about my mistakes, when I can ask for help. And so that means I have decided that the answer to do I matter and do I belong is yes. You created the environment where I can conclude that.
What are some of those qualities that go into creating that kind of culture to where I know I matter and I know I belong?
Well, first of all, telling people. I think people take for granted. People just assume that leaders assume people know. Why, I mean, of course you matter and belong. Why would you be here? People need to be told why their work matters. People don't walk in to the organization and go, oh, here's how I contribute to the mission. You as a leader have to create a clear line of sight to the most important priorities of the organization, to everybody's job, so that when I sit down there and I do my work, I'm not just passing a file off. I'm not just mopping a floor. I mean, we all know the story of the janitor at NASA saying, when asked, what are you doing here? I'm putting a man on the moon, right? And we found scores of stories in the book of organizations creating that environment where people understood that regardless of what the task was, they saw its significance to the mission. So you have to help people see that. The secondly is what is the first question you ask somebody in the morning? How are you? Or is that report finished? How much do you know about the people you lead? How well do you know about their families or their hobbies? Listen, for the last 2 years, we've been in each other's bedrooms.
We have.
We've seen the dirty laundry. We've seen the kids.
Dogs bark.
Right. People's personal lives are now very relevant to our experience. What have you asked about? What do you check? Do you check in before you check on? How are you? What is it you're affirming people for? How are you helping people who are of an underrepresented group know that their presence is important? Do you have privileged roles in your organization? So if you're a tech company, are the engineers privileged? If you're a sales company, are the salespeople privileged, or a growth company? If you're a brand company, are your marketers privileged? Now, it's not to say that all work is created equal. It's not. And I think we do our people a disservice when we try and convince them that all the work is equally important. All the people are equally important, but all the work is not. And it's okay to disproportionately invest in work that contributes to your competitive performance. But if that privilege becomes a status, if suddenly now the privileges of some roles disadvantage others, you no longer have a culture where people know their belonging is now qualified. So you have to go root out injustice. There are processes that are not fair to some people in your organization. Do you know what they are? And are you fixing them? So it's not enough to sort of say you care about fairness, or you say you care about equity. In the places in your organization where it's not equitable, what are you doing about it?
What are some of those most common processes that you see that are inequitable, Ron? Performance
management. You never heard somebody come into work and say, I'm so excited today's my performance review. Right? No, right. Not what they're thinking. When people leave those conversations, do they feel honored or do they feel demeaned? Do people have to wait 6 months to hear about a mistake they made in the past? First of all, we all know that categorization of people is an incredibly triggering event. And the research has now more than confirmed over decades of looking that putting people in categories has no value whatsoever. It doesn't help you make better decisions. It doesn't help you with career pathing. It doesn't help you understand their development needs any better. I had one client of mine. He was a high-performing executive, was on several succession slates, and I coached him for a year, and we intentionally booked our session to be after his performance review. He met with his boss. And we presumed all was going to go well. We presumed that he was still on track to, ascend a larger role within the next year. He came on the screen, it was virtual. He came on the screen and I could see the veins bulging out of his neck.
Oh, goodness.
And before I could say, Tim, he was like, she gave me a 3. I'm always a 4. But I got a 3. Now HR says there's a quota. And so who the heck got the 4s? Like he was irrational. And I said, oh my gosh, Tim, can you forward me the forms? I want to just read and I was expecting to read all this demeaning language and all this, disregarding of all the efforts he'd made that year. And I'm, while he's still perseverating, I'm reading through it and it's all fine. Like the language is accurate. She was highly complimentary and praising of his work. He was still on track to be a successor for a bigger job in the next 12 to 18 months. The discussion of his development needs was fair. They were still concerns.
Right.
It was the number. And turns out that categorical thinking is a trick. Our amygdala literally feels threatened when we get put in a box. Our brains go into a fight or flight mode when people try and fit us into something we don't want to fit into. And so it could have been a 4 and he still might have been triggered, right? It doesn't matter what the box means. It's just being put in the box. And he was having no different of a reaction than most people would do when they feel demeaned or narrowed or shrunk into a box they don't want to be put into. Nobody likes to be labeled.
Right.
And he felt it was unfair. Suddenly now there's this forced quota of only certain people can get 4s. And so she had to bump him down. What felt capriciously.
Oh, goodness.
And now the entire conversation, the entire experience of reviewing his work, of honoring his contributions is now washed away because of a number. Because of a number,
which kicked his caveman brain in.
And totally wanted to defend himself. And what a dumb thing to do. Like there's just what value are you going to have now, but you know who the 4s, 3s, and 2s and 1s are? First of all, most of us aren't using the 1s anyway, right? And if you have 1s, why are they still there?
Yeah.
So, we had budgeting processes, right? If you looked at how your budgets are distributed in your organization, are women getting the same concessions and considerations in their budgets as men? I bet you they're not.
Right.
Who gets strategic capital investments? Who gets the plum assignments? Look at them closely and look at the patterns. Don't look at your intentions because your intentions I'm sure are quite good.
Yep.
But look at the output, look at the data and see what's actually happening. And my guess is you will find a more unlevel playing field than you might imagine.
And usually due to some unconscious bias, but the numbers don't lie, right?
Yep. And if you're seen as a leader who is actively trying to root those things out, you are that much more likely to be trusted.
Wow. So let's talk about those cross-functional teams for just a moment, because I've seen it in so many industries, as Work Positive Nation has also, whether it's between sales and production, sometimes sales and marketing, right? What is it that creates, rather than this silo that we tend to fall into, what is it that creates a complementary harmony between these teams that you're referring to as cross-functional?
So what's interesting, Joey, is that most people don't understand that a seam has to be designed, right? Like in clothing, you don't just bring the fabric together and hope it sticks. You stitch it.
Right? If it's going to stay up.
On a baseball, that cloth is stitched at the baseball seam.
Absolutely.
The competitive value in your organization, the ways by which you differentiate yourself from competitors, no single function owns that, right? The capabilities of innovation happen at the intersection of marketing, customer insights, and R&D. Right? So if you're an executive, I don't see those 3 functions. I just see innovation. I expect the three of those functions to understand the contribution they make to innovation and to figure out how to work that out. But if I sit at a seam and I don't understand how 1 + 1 = 3, if I don't understand how you and I together create this other thing, then it's just about my thing versus your thing. Worse, you may have metrics that compete with mine. You may be being measured. If you're marketing, you're being measured on much longer term things than I am in sales, where I'm being measured on the quarter.
Right.
We had one organization where it was several divisions of a digital marketing community where one group was being measured on traffic, one group was being measured on conversion. They should have been sharing the same data set, but because their metrics were competitive, they hoarded the data from each other.
Wow.
So a lot of times, by default, our organizations are designed to generate rivalry. The conflict has been designed into the organization to be intractable. And so you have to step back and ask yourself, we do in our firm, we do what we call seam startups.
Okay.
We bring together the seams and we facilitate a conversation around what is the value you create together? Do you understand what it is? Do you understand it the same way? Do you understand what each of you contributes to it? Do you understand what you have to be good at to do it and where you're not good at it now? Do you understand who makes what decisions and when? Do you understand how to sustain trust? If there's conflict, you know how to resolve it. And we actually work them through a charter that says this is the seam you sit at. And when you come to the seam, it's not the UN, you're not the ambassador for marketing or the ambassador for supply chain. You are at this seam as a contributor to this capability. And we actually design a way for them to interact that allows them to really create that value. And if there are tensions that have been designed in, competing metrics, resource allocation processes that don't get information to the right person at the right time, inevitably, every time we do that session, we'll hear things like, oh, that's why you do that? Or, oh, no wonder I drive you crazy. I didn't know you needed it by every Tuesday. Or I didn't know you guys did that.
Wow.
Like these constant discoveries of all the concoctions and stories I've made up in my head about you, to the point where it's reflexive, right? I see you in my caller ID and I'm like, oh, what do they want?
Yeah.
Before I even want to answer the phone.
Right.
And so you have to sort of wash away all that baggage and recreate a relationship and redesign a seam so that we understand that when we come together, we're a different thing than when we're apart.
So you're connecting each of the divisions to a greater whole and then communicating across that seam, because the mind abhors a vacuum. You're going to make up your own stories about others. And
that story is going to often say how I'm more important than you.
Always.
And how you're here to serve me.
Because what's in it for me, right?
Jay Van Bevel at NYU wrote a book called The Power of Us. He did this fascinating experiment where he had people come together and just looking at pictures, just visuals. And when people were told, people in the picture are part of a different group, they're part of another tribe. People's amygdalas went on defense, right? It was sort of I was on guard. But the minute they were told they're part of your group, they're part of you, I saw them as welcoming. So just redefining how I define my tribe, how I define they, and how do I make they part of my we. It changes everything about how we see and interact with other people.
Well, we're back to belonging, aren't we? Or what Gary would call tribe.
Yeah, exactly right.
When I'm seeking to attract top talent, let's say I'm adding a position or there's a position open, how do I communicate these 4 qualifiers in such a way that I literally attract top talent that's going to be able to communicate across these seams and do the kinds of things we want to see done on our team?
Well, the first thing I would certainly ask is, tell me about experiences you've had working cross-functionally. If I were to go interview all the adjacent functions that you've interacted with, what would they tell me about you? When you've been in conflict with another division or department, what was it about and how did you resolve it? And then I want to simulate it. If this was a role where I was depending on this person to aggregate capabilities, where you had to bring together certain people to work in a more cooperative, coordinating way, I want to put you in a simulation. I want to watch you do it. I want to see the questions you ask. I want to see how you leveled the playing field. I want to see if you had biases toward functions that weren't yours. I want to see if there was favoritism. And, so I test it. Maybe you wouldn't come out perfectly, but at least I know what I was up against in hiring you.
Yeah, audition them, and instead of a role play, put them in a real play, right?
Put them in with the real people, with the real team, and make them work that stuff out.
Wow. Okay. And this collaborative, communicative process across the seams, being transparent, the other qualifiers that you mentioned, that must have a tremendous effect on reducing team turnover.
Oh, absolutely. Because people now know, the tensions of having to walk in every day, knowing that someone's going to, down the hall, is going to call you and ask you for something you don't have, or you don't want to give them, or you don't understand why they're asking. And they're getting more and more frustrated having to ask. So now you're feeling blamed and judged. Just creates all this free-floating anxiety and tension in the room that I just don't want to live with it. And so, until those, and then of course, then you see the added personality issues of two leaders who see each other as nemesis, or they're vying for the same job. And so, when mom and dad fight, the kids fight. And so many people will often attribute the conflict to just its personalities. And rarely it is some type of, weirdness between two people. Almost always it's below the waterline. It's almost designed in metrics or processes or access to information or other resources are not leveled right. And so there's other things designed into the system that are causing the conflict. And you have to dig those out. You have two different work processes that are meant to come together and that don't technologically. So you have now 18 manual steps that somebody has to go through to get these two things to work together. And I don't think it's me. I think it's you. And you think it's me, not you. And so now this pile of stuff just piles up for months. And all of a sudden somebody 5 levels up says, I need this report. And now we're fighting over this pile of stuff that we didn't process. Right. Because technology wasn't designed to help us work seamlessly. And so it just, not my problem.
Right. And that's when the silos develop. What are some of the more common challenges you see, Ron? By the way, Ron Carucci is my guest on this episode of the Work Positive Podcast. Go right now to tobehonest.net and just look at some of the amazing things there. We'll be finished in a few minutes. You can watch those. How many videos? 15 videos of your
15 episodes of the interviews from the book.
Yeah, man, that's amazing. Tobehonest.net. What are some of the challenges that you see that companies are having today, especially coming out of the pandemic? And we're discussing hybrid work or remote work or scattered work, whatever you want to call it, in really incarnating these 4 qualifiers to create the kind of positive work culture they want.
Joey, people are still sort of trying to fend through the whole hybrid thing. Yeah. We have leaders from days gone by who are insisting, who just can't let go of a workplace that's a physical one. Despite the fact that their most important people, their most important talent is saying, we don't need to do this. And so rather than trying to figure out what's right for our organization and what's right for our people, they're imposing these artificial, has to be 4 days a week, or has to be 3 days a week. Or they're saying, everybody back in the office. And then you have, someone has to police that. You have to accept that the pandemic changed us. I think in many cases, cultures of empathy, compassion, curiosity, engagement were unleashed by the pandemic because people had no choice. In some cases, sadly, we're seeing regression. We're seeing back to, okay, well, that's over with now. We can go back to being not nice anymore. and it's unfortunate because
people very unfortunate.
Worked hard for those gains. People sacrificed and suffered to learn to be compassionate, and they want to stay that way. And so, hybrid workplaces are a design challenge, and you have to design them to meet the needs of your organization. And if you're only basing it on your real estate costs or your sunk cost of already prepaid leases for 10 years, that's just foolish. It's just a fool's errand. So I certainly think where work happens and when work happens is still a tug of war. Frankly, it's a waste of time. You're just fighting a battle you can't win. If you think that a slowdown economy is going to put a bomb over mass exodus of talented people, you're wrong. Sure, people are on edge because we're seeing all the tech sector, in these massive layoffs. Right. And some of them even admitting it was irresponsible growth. We exploited the pandemic, and now we don't need capacity anymore. Well, shame on you.
Yes.
But for the most part, people are still voting with their feet. And we're seeing your best talent still quitting and leaving, and your mediocre talent quitting and staying. And, toward what end? So you can say you won? I think many leaders got the memo in the pandemic about it used to be things like compassion and empathy and curiosity and authenticity were these highfalutin woo-woo leadership things that,
Right.
like soft leaders. And now I think many leaders got the memo. Those are now table stakes. You're not going to be trusted. Today, leadership is no longer the noble role it used to be, where because you were a leader, you were just shown regard and respect. Now, when you become a leader, respect and trust is withdrawn, and you have to re-earn it. You could have been somebody's peer for 5 years, but the minute you become their boss, it's a reset. So, and how leaders go about doing that with credibility, where you can't purchase their loyalty, you can't bribe them, you can do all that, but you won't be able to sustain it, and you can't boss them into compliance.
No.
How do you reconnect with those you're leading in ways that make them want to follow you? It's a different contract now, and I think the pandemic opened that door. And I think for some leaders, they're getting it well, and for some leaders, they're still trying to figure it out.
And we had begun to see a shift toward that with two generations, millennials and Gen Zs, coming into the workforce. But man, the pandemic just poured jet fuel on that fire and caused it to erupt. And yet this week, Ron, we saw, the company that delivers cardboard boxes on my front porch at least 2 or 3 times a week. We saw their CEO come out and say, hey, we're coming back to work, get your butt back in the chair.
Yep.
How do we address that to help people really realize that a positive work culture is all about these kinds of qualities we're talking about?
Well, I think he probably believes the workforce he leads is dispensable and replaceable. He may find out differently.
Right?
Well, it's unfortunate. You're just fighting over the wrong things. Many leaders are trying to claim that their performance shortfalls or productivity dips are due to remote work. Well, all the data would contradict that.
Every single study.
Yeah. So, you have to examine your own control needs, your own ego, your own, sense of agency in the world about what it is you think your role is as a leader, and re-examine that. And if you think that controlling the location of your workers and and you think that they're not going to make you pay. And the problem is in the tech sector, the secret nobody wants to talk about is that you spent 10 years teaching them to be entitled. You fed them free food, you gave them massages, you gave them napping pods, you gave them all these perks that taught them you were there to coddle them. And suddenly now you're trying to arbitrarily impose standards and expectations on them, and you think that entirely you trained them. So they're not just going to suddenly decide, oh, I shouldn't be entitled anymore. Now I should accommodate you. You were so nice to me for 10 years with the free food. I should show up to work. That's not how they're going to think.
No.
And so, you have to own the fact that you conditioned them to expect certain things from you, like excessive accommodation. And now you're frustrated by that because you feel like the teaching how they're so unbalanced that you think just exerting your will and your authority is somehow going to rebalance it. It's not. No,
you don't have that in your arsenal any longer because if there was a conspiracy, then you were complicit in it because you helped create the conditions, right? Yeah. Ron Carucci is my guest on this episode of the Work Positive podcast. Go to tobeHonest.net right now. Ron, what are we going to find there? We've got 15 episodes. We've got 15 episodes of the TV series called Moments of Truth. You're going to see a 6-video webinar series on the book, sharing all the research findings. You're going to find scores of articles from Harvard Business Review and Forbes and other places that sort of feature the research. And of course, ways to order the book. Wonderful.
And if you want to learn more about our work, you can come to Navalent, NAVALENT.com. And we've got videos and free ebooks on leading change and culture. We've got org design free ebooks. We've got lots of videos and white papers. So it's a treasure trove of resources there as well.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that with Work Positive Nation. Work Positive Nation always wants to know from my guest, Ron, one thing. So, Ron Carucci, what's your one thing you would encourage Work Positive Nation to do starting today to create a positive work culture?
Tell the truth. Here's a way to think about this weekend assignment. Go back over your calendar for the last 2 weeks and pick out some moments where in the privacy of your own mind and heart, that you behaved in ways that don't reflect what you say you value. Maybe you were snide to the barista, or you embellished data to your boss, or you ignored your kids because you had a deadline, or you weren't kind to somebody. But whatever it was, and examine those behaviors, because what I guarantee you'll find is a pattern. those moments where we are less than true to ourselves are not random. We choose those behaviors because they serve a purpose. You told yourself unconsciously that you'd feel safer, or you'd feel more important, or you'd engineer a certain reaction from people. And if you want a more work positive environment, a more trustworthy environment, you have to start by being honest about the things that bring you to your moments of being untrustworthy. And so start by looking in and see what you learn.
And tell the truth. Beautiful. Ron Carucci, tobehonest.net is the website. Go there right now, snag yourself a copy of the book and start reading it today. And do his one thing, just tell the truth today. Ron, thank you so much for the gift of your time and wisdom today. Work Positive Nation, along with myself, we're better because of this conversation. Thank you.
Joey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Work Positive Podcast. Please share this podcast with your friends who are HR and small business leaders so they can do one thing today to create a positive work culture that increases productivity and profits. I'd like to give you a free Work Positive course just for listening. It's called Something to Talk About, and it's transformed the work conversations of so many people all over the world. Get your free copy when you go to workpositive.today/something to talk about, and you can start transforming your conversations today. Remember, it pays to work positive.